Have you ever wondered if addiction is more than just a bad habit? What if it's not just a weakness or lack of willpower, but a deeper cry from the soul, a desperate yearning for wholeness? At first glance, addiction might seem like nothing more than a failure of self-control, something to be conquered through discipline and choice. But what if this view misses the mark entirely? What if addiction is far more profound, a reflection of an inner fracture, a spiritual hunger that refuses to be silenced? Carl Jung, whose work explored the vast and mysterious terrain of the unconscious, saw addiction not as a character flaw, but as a singular, misguided attempt to restore something sacred. Beneath every compulsion, every dependency, and every self-destructive act, Jung perceived an underlying fracture, the gap between a fragmented self and the deep yearning to reconnect with something greater, something that transcends the limitations of the ego. The addict, in Jung's eyes, is not simply weak-willed. Rather, they are a soul estranged from its center, desperately seeking contact with the divine spark that gives life its depth and orientation. Addiction, according to Jung, is not defined by the substance or behavior itself, but by the hollow ache that underlies it. The addict is not merely seeking a substance. They are seeking to fill a void within a question they may not even be able to articulate. What am I really missing? This pain is existential. It's the kind of discomfort that doesn't have a clear answer. A restlessness that can't be quieted by logic, by words, or by any external thing. The addict often cannot name what they are searching for, but the hunger is real. It is the soul's longing for something deeper, for meaning, for connection, for the reconciliation of a self that feels broken. In this search, the addict turns outward toward alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, food, or even endless scrolling. These behaviors become more than habits. They transform into false sacraments, temporary rituals through which the soul tries to touch the sacred, to find some semblance of the divine. But these objects of dependence are substitutes for meaning, for connection, for the inner union the addict cannot even name but feels deeply. What they truly long for is not the substance, but a sense of inner coherence, a relationship with something greater, a union with a deeper meaning that transcends the limitations of the ego. Yet, no matter how potent the relief feels, it is fleeting. It dulls the pain for hours, maybe days, before the hollow ache returns with even greater intensity. And so, the spiral continues. The more the addict clutches at the external, the further they drift from the internal axis of their suffering. Jung saw this spiral not as a moral failing, but as a spiritual hunger, a sacred yearning for truth, unity, and self-reconciliation. Addiction, in this light, becomes the unconscious, crying out for contact with the eternal, the divine. In ancient times, the consumption of mind-altering substances was never casual. It was wrapped in ritual, protected by myth, and guided by elders. It was a portal to the divine, a descent into the symbolic cosmos, a way to commune with the gods. Today, however, in a desacralized world devoid of ritual and inward mythos, the modern addict unconsciously mimics this ancient pattern. But without the structure, without the symbol, and without the soul, the same substances that once connected the individual to the divine now devour the spirit, leading not to transcendence, but to collapse. Jung warned that man cannot survive by logic alone. He needs symbols, living images of the divine to guide and orient his psyche. When these inner symbols decay and myth dies, the soul begins to fragment. In this fragmentation, addiction as a moral error, but as a failed ritual, a broken initiation. It is a misguided attempt to restore sacredness in a world that no longer speaks the language of the soul. When the soul is wounded, it does not bleed outward. It bleeds inward, searching blindly for a salve in whatever form it can find, and so the journey of addiction continues, not just as a physical battle, but as a deeply spiritual struggle. It is the search for something lost, for something sacred. The question remains, can the soul be healed, and the fragmented self reunited with its deeper purpose? The answer lies not in external sources, but in a profound inner awakening. Addiction, then, is not simply a habit or a vice. It is a symbolic cry for healing, an unconscious rite performed in the shadows, an urgent, often clumsy attempt to mend what the psyche itself can no longer bear. The addict, in this light, is not a transgressor of will, but a seeker of wholeness. Their actions, though misguided, are legitimate in their search for relief, an attempt to fill a void that seems impossible to name. This is precisely why your work continues to cast such a powerful influence over the birth of recovery movements like Alcoholics Anonymous. When Bill Wilson reached out to Jung, it wasn't for a clinical formula, but for something much deeper, key to the soul itself. Jung, with his characteristic clarity, responded by saying, "The only true cure for addiction is a spiritual awakening, a profound inner transformation that reshapes the psychic landscape. Spiritus contra spiritum," he wrote. Only spirit can conquer spirit. Not laws, not discipline, but the birth of meaning. Not suppression, but integration. From Jung's perspective, addiction is not a pathology to be eradicated, but a message, a symptom of the soul's exile. It is a luminous signal flashing from the unconscious, calling the individual to descend, to look beneath the surface of the symptoms, and to confront the deeper wound. Like all true crises, addiction carries within it the seed of metamorphosis. This descent is not a plunge into darkness, but a sacred opportunity to reclaim what has been lost, not merely abstaining from a substance, but awakening to a forgotten self. Jung did not speak of curing the addict in the sterile sense of fixing a malfunction. Rather, he spoke of guiding them back to their inner center, to that vital flame buried beneath years of fear, denial, and despair. The suffering of the addict, as harrowing as it may be, reveals something astonishing within them. Still stirs a longing for the eternal, a yearning for something real, even if buried beneath guilt and confusion. That yearning is the ember of transformation. It is not punishment that awakens the soul, it is meaning. And meaning only emerges when the bottom is reached, not just externally, but internally, when the ego shatters and the deeper self begins to stir. The path to healing begins to reveal itself. Many addicts describe a void, an emptiness so vast they cannot name it. Jung, with his unparalleled insight, saw that this emptiness is not a lack of substance, but a fragmentation of the psyche itself. The addict is not craving a drug. They are yearning for reunion with love, with safety, with their own soul. What they truly seek in the substance is not the substance itself, but what it symbolizes: wholeness, comfort, power, forgiveness, belonging. In this light, we no longer see the addict as broken, but as someone on an archetypal path, not of indulgence, but of return. This is a path that, if embraced with consciousness, can lead not to destruction, but to awakening. Here we arrive at a core Jungian insight. Addiction is not merely a habit. It is a symbol in the language of the soul. Every symptom is a messenger. The psyche, when wounded, does not shout in logic. It whispers in symbols, in behaviors, in repetitions. that may seem irrational but carry profound inner meaning. In Jung's view, addiction is not an accident of biology nor a mere failure of will. It is a psychic message, a coded plea from the unconscious crying out for balance, integration, and wholeness. It reveals that something essential within the individual has been cast into exiles, something that longs not to destroy, but to be understood, to pathologize the addict, without seeking the symbolic message behind. The pattern is to silence the very voice that could guide healing. Jung never asked us to excuse destructive behaviors, but he did teach us to look beneath them, to ask not what is wrong with you, but what is your suffering trying to say? Seen through this lens, addiction becomes an archetypal narrative, not a moral defect. But the wounded inner child seeking a lost parent, the dismembered soul yearning for reunion, the divine thirst, misdirected toward earthly substitutes. Behind the self-destruction lies an ancient longing, a forgotten truth buried in the rubble of repression. For Jung, to dismiss this longing is to deny the humanity of the addict. He reminds us that the wound is the place where the light enters, and it is through that wound, that longing, that the soul may find its way back home. The light enters, and the substance, the behavior, is only the outer symptom. The true work lies within. What the addict chases externally is often a reflection of what they were forced to abandon within themselves. Addiction, then, becomes not just a trap, but a compass. Misaligned, yes, but not meaningless. It points not toward pleasure, but toward an unfulfilled need, toward a wholeness that has yet to be realized. It is, at its core, a cry for a spiritual experiencer, reconnection with the sacred center of one's being. But to respond to this cry, one must descend, not into shame, but into inquiry. The question is no longer, why are you addicted? But rather, what are you truly seeking beneath this pain? When someone reaches again and again for relief they don't understand, when they feel possessed by an inner force that moves without their consent, they are confronting the very face of the shadow. Jung taught us that the shadow is not evil, it is everything we refuse to see in ourselves. It is the forgotten, the unwanted, the unacceptable. It contains our primal emotions, unmet needs, and ancient wounds, banished not because they are wicked, but because they threatened our adaptation, our image, our survival. Yet what is buried in the unconscious is never truly gone. It transforms, and when it is not welcomed consciously, it demands expression elsewhere in compulsion, in craving, in collapse. But within that collapse, paradoxically, lies the doorway to awakening. For if the shadow is met with courage and compassion, it no longer sabotages. It begins to serve. One of the most common disguises the shadow wears is addiction. It is not a symptom of moral failure, but of profound psychic division. At the heart of every addictive pattern lies an inner war. On one side stands the persona, the outer mask striving for control, success, acceptance, and the illusion of wholeness. On the other lies the hidden self, the wounded terrain of the psyche that carries unspoken grief, repressed rage, and long-forgotten sorrow. Rather than confront this buried anguish, the addict attempts to suppress it, to numb it into silence. But as Jung taught us, the shadow cannot be banished without consequence. What is repressed does not fade into oblivion, it returns, with greater force, demanding to be seen. And when ignored, it leaks into our actions in moments of weakness, in self-sabotaging choices, in behaviors that mystify even the one acting them out. What makes this struggle even more insidious is that the addict often misidentifies the enemy. They believe the battle is against the substance, the temptation, or the external world. But in truth, the conflict is internal, a silent tug-of-war between the part of the self that seeks to express the pain and the part that fears it, judges it, and locks it away. This inner friction produces a deep psychic tension and untraceable anxiety that gnaws at the soul, eroding one's sense of peace. Even when the substance is removed, the emptiness often remains. Irritability, depression, and confusion linger not because the chemical dependency persists, but because the true wound has not been touched. The drug, the habit, the behavior was never the root. It was only the symptom, a veil over the deeper cry. And so, the shadow shifts forms from alcohol to overwork, from sex to food, from narcotics to compulsive scrolling. The object changes, but the pattern repeats, because the inner split remains. Unhealed, Jung understood that shadow integration is not a task for the faint of heart. It demands courage, radical honesty, and a willingness to peer into the mirror without distortion. It is about acknowledging those parts of the self that have been hidden, despised, or feared. It is not about blaming the outside world, nor excusing harm, but about reclaiming authorship of one's life by bringing the unconscious into the light. When a person begins this inner journey, they are stepping into the unknown, into the depths of their own soul, to heal the fractures that have been ignored for so long. This is the process of facing the shadow, not as an enemy, but as an integral part of the self, longing for integration and understanding. It is the path to wholeness. Stop seeing addiction as a curse and begin to recognize it for what it truly is, a symbol, a messenger carrying urgent news from the depths of the soul. Something within needs attention. Something longs for understanding, not suppression. This perspective does not deny responsibility. In fact, it deepens it. True transformation is not achieved by simply fighting symptoms, but by illuminating their source. When the shadow is brought into consciousness, it no longer rules from the dark. The individual is no longer its captive, but its student. In this act of turning inward, something profound occurs. The compulsion loosens its grip. The behavior that once held so much power begins to lose its sacred role as the only source of relief. In its place, a more intimate, honest relationship with the self begins to emerge. One where destructive impulses are no longer commands, but signals. And in hearing those signals, the healing begins. In many instances, addiction is the echo of a past not yet digested by the conscious mind, traumas of abandonment, wounds of humiliation, silent hours of emotional starvation. These do not simply fade with time. They sink beneath awareness into the realm of the unconscious, where they quietly ferment, accumulating psychic tension. The shadow becomes their keeper. Even when the mind forgets, the soul remembers. And so, the addict drinks, smokes, injects, consumes not merely to escape, but to anesthetize the soul's unwept grief. Repetition becomes ritual not as a conscious rebellion, but as an unconscious prayer, an invocation for numbness over memory. Yet, the more one flees from this forgotten pain, the more power it gains. What is not integrated turns to projection. The unclaimed shadow begins to stain the world around us. Friends become threats, love is mistrusted, and life is interpreted through a lens of suspicion. The addict becomes trapped, not just by the substance, but by a distorted perception. They see the world through a mirror, cracked by exile from their own inner truth. This, Jung reminds us, is no longer merely a clinical issue, it is a spiritual initiation, for to face the shadow is to confront the sacred. It is to kneel before the unlit altar of the soul and say, I am ready to see what I once could not. This is not weakness, it is initiation. True healing cannot be imposed from the outside. It cannot be commanded through logic or forced by willpower. It must arise from a courageous descent inward. The addict must become a traveler into their own psychic underworld, not to dwell in the darkness, but to converse with it, to ask, "What have you come to teach me?" In Jungian view, the shadow is not merely darkness. It is potential wrapped in pain. The gold is in the shadow. Beneath the debris of rejection and repression lie lost capacities, raw feelings, instinctual wisdom, sacred anger, and buried creativity. Shadow integration is the art of rescuing these exiled parts of the self, not to be ruled by them, but to welcome them into conscious wholeness. The addict begins to see not a broken self, but a divided one. And in that recognition, shame softens into understanding. What was once seen as weakness now becomes a map. The scar becomes a signpost. The addiction, no longer a sentence, becomes a summons to a deeper life. This path is not linear. It wins, falters, and repeats. But through presence and compassion, something changes. A person begins to feel not just the pain, but the meaning of the pain. They start to decipher the language of their suffering. In doing so, a new kind of presence emerges, one that is not built on avoidance but on truth, not perfection but integration. From this inner alchemy, a more rooted, conscious, and powerful self takes form. Jung observed that those burdened by deep suffering did not always require explanations. They needed an inner experience, something so symbolic, so soul-touching, that it could reorder the chaos within and breathe life back into their shattered center. Not an intellectual answer, but an encounter with the sacred. A moment of inward revelation that could rethread the broken narrative of their existence. This reordering often doesn't come through formal religion, but through a genuine spiritual encounter, something that awakens the feeling of belonging to something greater than the fragmented self. And this connection, Jung believed, is where true healing begins. The soul, once fragmented, is reassembled by the power of this sacred encounter. And in that reassembly, the addict finds not only relief, but transformation. Healing, as Jung believed, was not an optional luxury. It was a necessity, deeply rooted in the very structure of the human psyche. In his clinical practice, Jung observed that those who could not access a symbolic relationship with the sacred remained trapped in cycles of suffering. They repeated compulsions, not out of moral weakness, but because they lacked a deeper meaning, powerful enough to carry them through transformation. Addiction, seen through this lens, becomes a distorted longing for spiritual transcendence. It is a misguided attempt to dissolve the ego, to escape the unbearable weight of fragmentation, and to taste, even if only momentarily, a sense of unity. But when this yearning is directed toward substances or compulsions, the soul's hunger only deepens. The opposite of healing occurs: further division and greater inner exile. To transform, the psyche must encounter a symbol potent enough to act as its new axis, mundi, a central image, a dream, a vision that speaks not to the intellect but to the soul. Such a symbol cannot be imposed from the outside. It must arise from within, often only after the person has faced the darkness with humility and chosen not to run. It is only then that the unconscious reveals its hidden map, not a maze of despair, but a journey of meaning. Across all cultures, myths, archetypes, and rituals have existed because they serve this sacred function. They give suffering context. They offer the soul a story where pain is not senseless, but initiatory. This is why the addict does not merely need abstinence, they need symbolic death. A letting go of the false identity they clung to for survival and a rebirth into something more whole. This rebirth is not achieved through force of will, but through surrender not to weakness, but to the inner process, to the silent intelligence of the soul. In that surrender, the symbolic begins to speak. Fire is no longer just destruction. It becomes purification. Darkness is no longer an enemy. It becomes fertile ground. What was once unbearable becomes bearable not because it is less painful, but because it now carries meaning. And where there is meaning, there is strength. Spiritual or therapeutic support may guide the path, but it cannot manufacture the symbol. It can only help prepare the psyche to receive it. The true alchemy happens in stillness, in the invisible moment when the soul chooses not to flee, but to feel. In that moment, what once seemed like a narrative of failure is transfigured into a myth of redemption. Suffering becomes a sacred teacher. Pain becomes a portal. An addiction, once seen as a curse, becomes the wounded cry of the soul seeking rebirth. For, as Jung once reminded us, only the wounded physician heals. Perhaps, then, the addict, through the very wound they carry, holds the seed of profound transformation, if only they can find the courage to listen. As that seed begins to take root within the psyche, it does not simply change what one does. It alters how one sees. The individual no longer identifies with their wounds as if they were their only name. Instead, they begin to see themselves through the mirror of transcendences, a being capable not merely of surviving the wound, but of transfiguring it. No longer drawn toward numbness, they move toward presence. No longer haunted by the desire to disappear, they step fully into the arena of their own becoming. In this sacred participation with life, suffering is no longer viewed as punishment. It becomes initiation. The addict, once cast as a passive character bound to repetition, now reclaims authorship of their own myth. It is a journey not away from darkness, but through it, toward wholeness. In this transformation, pain becomes wisdom. The shadow ceases to be a feared adversary and instead emerges as a guide. The symbol, once a distant idea, becomes the heartbeat of the healing process. It is no longer just a concept, it is a living, breathing part of the self, guiding the way toward integration, strength, and a newfound sense of wholeness. Healing, from this Jungian perspective, is not about returning to how things were. It is not about regressing or returning to a previous state of being, but rather about birth. Something entirely new emerges from the soil of descent. It is a form of life that could only grow through the crucible of the abyss. The symbol, in this context, is not just an intellectual accessory, but the doorway to a deeper reality, a world in which self-understanding becomes reconciliation. Reconciliation with the past, with the pain, and ultimately with the sacred possibility of one's own freedom. When the symbol has germinated in the soul, life no longer revolves around avoidance, but around awareness. It was always space, a holy womb, a sacred container where something authentic could finally be conceived. Addiction, then, with all its chaos, shame, and longing, becomes the fractured language of a soul crying out to be seen. And when that cry is met with genuine attention, with the kind of listening that does not judge, does not fix, but simply witnesses, the compulsion to escape begins to dissolve. Wholeness does not require perfection. It requires truth. The courage to face oneself, not with violence, but with compassion. The healing of the addict is not about forgetting or erasing the past. It is about remembering. Remembering that even in their darkest hour, a seed of light was already buried within. Carl Jung did not offer solutions in the modern sense. He offered initiation, a symbolic pathway by which each soul might encounter its own myth. For at the heart of every addiction lies a plea for meaning, and at the core of every redemption is a reconciliation with the mystery of being human. That is where the true journey begins, not when the pain ends, but when it is no longer feared, when the silence beneath suffering becomes the place where freedom begins to rise. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home? Or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion that love must hurt, that self-abandonment is the price of connection, or that they are unworthy of peace, share this video with them. Help me reach those who need to remember that real love does not demand that we shrink. True connection does not ask for the sacrifice of the soul, and the most vital union we will ever form is the one with our own inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here, in this space, we journey beneath the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the whispers of the unconscious, and how every relationship is but a mirror reflecting our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you would like us to explore in future videos, leave it below. This space breathes because of you. Your voice is not only welcome here, it is essential. Thank you for showing up, not just for this video, but for your inner work, for the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this: when the right person appears, your soul will know not through fear, but through peace. But until that moment, let your most intimate relationship be the one you cultivate within. That is the foundation. That is the home. And from that wholeness, all things real are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.